Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to this webinar titled The Defense Never Rests, Tackling Stigma and Discrimination in the HIV Response. My name is Dr. Tessa O'Rara-Lawrence. The aim of this webinar will be to provide an opportunity to discuss stigma and discrimination on this symbolic day, Zero Discrimination Day. The IAS is hosting this debate looking at the global approach towards injustice in the HIV response. The debate will highlight challenges faced by people living with and vulnerable to HIV in getting access to effective prevention, treatment, as well as HIV care services. And it will look at how these challenges can be addressed. It will focus on positioning action on HIV-related stigma and discrimination as separate and distinct, and will discuss how best to effect inclusive and positive change in the global HIV response. Before we start, I'd like to go through a couple of housekeeping issues and rules for the webinar. Please note that due to the number of attendees, all participants are muted. But if you have any questions, if you look at the bottom, you'll see a Q&A box. So please put any questions that you may have for the speakers at any time there. You'll also notice the thumbs up box symbol when someone asks a question in the Q&A box. If you have a similar question or find this question important, please click on the thumbs up sign to help us prioritize the questions. Just in case you're having any issues with Zoom, you can find additional guidance provided in the chat box. Please send us any technical questions that you may have there. That's in the chat box. We have planned some time after the debate for Q&A, so please do send your questions. And if you have a question for a specific debater, please indicate their name when typing in your question. Please kindly remember to focus your questions on today's topic. And if you have any comments or just want to post about the event, please use our hashtag, the Twitter hashtag Heart of Stigma. And finally, if you have any questions, we encourage you to consult the IAS website. You can also send other questions as well as suggestions to the email address iasedu@iassociety.org. I would now like to welcome the moderator and debaters. Dr. Laurel Sprague from UNAIDS is our today's moderator. Dr. Sprague is the Chief of Community Mobilization at UNAIDS Geneva in Switzerland. So I would like to welcome and hand over to Dr. Sprague.
Thank you very much for the welcome. Colleagues, it's such a delight to be here with you today. I want to offer a really sincere thanks to IAS for inviting me to be part of this, what I think is going to be a really interesting and hopefully fun segment. And also for having the thought to host this this session for all of us on this really important topic on this day. As I was thinking about some opening sort of framing words to start this, kick off this debate, I was remembering something that Malcolm X said, of course, very many years ago, which is that he said that racism is like a Cadillac. There's a new model every year. And I reflect on that sometimes to think, how does that relate to the work we do on HIV and HIV-related discrimination and other kinds of stigma and discrimination? What can we learn from the fight against racism in the work that we do? And one of the things I think is really useful in that analogy from Malcolm X is that the old Cadillacs don't go away. So we have to always be aware that something new, that new manifestations may be coming forward in the way that people are judged and mistreated and oppressed. But the old ones don't go away either. And so we continually have this piling on of new manifestations. And I think that there's a useful message we can take in that for the way that we attend to and approach HIV-related stigma. We certainly have seen in the last year that COVID and COVID-related stigma certainly hasn't displaced HIV stigma, but has also provided new ways for people living with HIV and the people most affected by HIV in key population groups to experience and be the subjects or targets of stigma and discrimination. I also think that those of us who've been working in the field of HIV-related stigma and discrimination for decades and more, that at least for myself, sometimes I'd like to move on and focus on something else. That I would like to have this work be finished and that we could do focus on some other things. But the reality that I've found, and probably all of you as well, is that when you talk to people living with HIV in all regions, in all countries, and you talk to the groups of key populations in all regions, in all countries, they consistently say, no, this work isn't done. It's HIV stigma and discrimination that keep us from being able to have good health and being able to have the quality of life that we deserve. Just to share some quick numbers with you, I think these are very helpful. A UNAIDS analysis at the end of last year models that any failure to make progress from where we are now against HIV-related stigma and discrimination, that, as we know, it will undermine testing, treatment, and adherence for people living with HIV. It's expected to increase to result. So if we don't make any change on current levels of stigma and discrimination, we anticipate an additional 440,000 deaths from AIDS between now and the year of 2030. So the situation is grave. And we also anticipate tremendously more new infections from HIV. It may seem like a soft science, right? But it's urgent, grave work that needs to be done, and we do know how to move the needle on stigma and discrimination when we have the will and the resources and the technical assistance to do that. So let's move on to our panelists in the debate. We know that this is urgent work to be done. We know that resources are always limited. We're constantly being reminded of the resource limitations. I've been talking about stigma and discrimination interchangeably, but we're not going to do that now in this debate. We're going to tease these out and set up a little bit of a conflict, a debate between two really well respected, esteemed, loved researchers and advocates in this field. We're going to hear from Ellen Maleche, who is the executive director of KELN, which is the Kenya Legal and Ethical Issues Network on HIV and AIDS. And we're going to hear from Alice Wellborn, who is the founding director of the Salamander Trust in the UK. They have impressive biographies that I'm not going to go into so that we can get right into the heart of this debate today. I think the audience will be the judge of how the debate plays out. So what you will hear is the best defense from each, and then we'll hear your thoughts on the prioritization of stigma versus discrimination. So let me start with Dr. Wellborn to speak to us about why we need to prioritize and put our attention on HIV-related stigma. Alice, the floor is yours. And thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Laurel, and thanks so much to IAS for inviting me to take part today. It's a great pleasure. Of course, stigma and discrimination should have no place in any of our lives, and especially not in the context of HIV. However, as a social anthropologist by background and training, and as a woman living with HIV who's also experienced a lot of stigma and discrimination, I have learned that around the world we all have stigmatizing feelings, emotions, and thoughts in our lives. So where does stigma come from, and how can we address it? It's important to recognize that none of us is born with these thoughts, but we usually do acquire them from those around us. Everyone across the world develops a sense of identity as they grow and learn about the world around them. We seek first and foremost to protect ourselves from the unknown and to seek comfort from people like us. We all have an old reptile part of our brains, like the rest of the animal world, which means that we still have a strong default fight or flight or freeze reaction. So unless we are very fortunate to grow up in a very positive, enlightened, inquiring, receptive environment, we all learn as we grow up to seek protection in what is familiar to us. And we learn to fear and reject anyone or anything unfamiliar as something that could bring us danger, whether we look or sound different in any way, or believe different things, or act differently, or have a physical or mental condition, or whatever. So we each grow up somehow in a bubble of seeking comfort and solidarity in the known and trying to avoid or fight the unknown. So this learnt world becomes our norm, and we often just don't notice that others might see the world in a wholly different way. So most people see this picture on your screen, for example, clearly as one animal, and can often be amazed that others might see a different animal there and not the one you see. And others still might see both animals. Can you see that on your screen? There we go. So others still might see both animals or even more and not understand why others can't see them. Often we then mix up what others think with who they are. So when we argue against others' views, we can also reject them as people because of their views. And this is where stigma can become really especially dangerous. So sadly, where stigma grows, anger and violence often follow, particularly when stigma is against groups in society who hold less political, physical, or socioeconomic power than those who hold the dominant views. Yet if we understand how our brains work better, we can also grow to learn that within this volcano of violence are normally layers of fear and hurt and need. And if we support people who have these volcanoes inside them to address and unpack these layers, we can often diffuse the explosion and enable people who once feared the unknown and rejected it vehemently to overcome their strong reactions and grow to learn about and even embrace and celebrate the rich diversity of perspectives around them and the people who hold these perspectives. And language is one route into unlocking this key to what we call social norms change. Language lies somehow on the boundary between stigma on the one hand, which is more to do with what people think and feel, and discrimination on the other, which is what people do. You can still act justly, even if you have stigmatizing thoughts and feelings. And using the right language to describe people and situations can help us to build policies and practices which are far more just and equitable than those we currently have. For example, we have EMTCT, which stands for Elimination of Mother-to-Child Transmission of HIV, and we measure health workers' success in achieving this. Yet these very words make me recoil. If we were to replace them with ESRHR, where this stands for Ensuring the Sexual and Reproductive Health and Rights of Women Living with HIV, and we started measuring health workers' performance in upholding our rights through our experiences of quality healthcare throughout pregnancy, we'd be promoting a positive phrase, doing what women have called for years, and ensuring that the women concerned are best placed to keep their babies HIV-free, which is what the policymakers wanted. So a simple shift in language from the negative and focusing just on a disease outcome to the positive and focusing on women at the time when they're most in need of everyone's support can make the world of difference. Okay, words alone can't change the world, but where attention goes, energy flows. So when we use positive, affirmative language, this has huge effects on our feelings, thoughts, and actions, and on our physical health and quality of life. So growing acorns of hope and support through planting positive language can create forests of affirmative action.
Alice, thank you so much. There's so much richness in there. We're not going to unpack it at the moment. What I'm going to do is turn the floor over to our other debater, to Alan Maleche, to make the case for us that stigma may be important, but it's discrimination where we need to put our attention. And so, Alan, over to you to hear your lawyerly perspective on this.
Thank you, Laurel, and well done to Alice, who makes a very persuasive case around why we should focus on stigma. I know in our real lives it's very difficult to distinguish the two or even put the two together, but I will make a frail attempt towards making a case as to why discrimination is something that we need to continue to focus on, especially in the context of HIV. I share this from my background of about 12 years working closely with people living with and affected by HIV, by offering them legal support, legal counsel, legal advice, and actual court representation in cases where they have actually been stigmatized, which has resulted in discrimination and which consequently has resulted to a violation of their human rights. We all know that discrimination is the unjust or prejudicial treatment of different persons on grounds of race, age, sex, disability, health status. And we've learned in the field of HIV that this could mean both. You could be Black, you could be disabled, you could be poor, you could be HIV positive, and you're subjected to discrimination on all these particular grounds. And what I've learned from my experience at Kelly, my experience at the Global Fund, my experience working with our colleagues on the UNAIDS Human Rights Reference Group is that unless you address discrimination, you find it difficult to get people coming forward to test for HIV. Find it difficult for women to walk into clinics who need maternal health care. And because of acts of discrimination, some that I have witnessed in Kenya, including women who are living with HIV, who are then perceived not to be fit enough to give birth to children and thus forced to tubal ligation, are some of the experiences where we see discrimination manifesting itself in the context of human rights violations, and all this caused by stigma. So that's why then we have to see, how do you focus on that discriminatory act? The discriminatory act that sees a member of parliament, a legislator, deciding to go forth to put forward a law that knows will criminalize populations that are already vulnerable to getting HIV, people who use drugs, transgender persons, men who have sex with men, sex workers. But because of the prejudice that you hold, you continue to carry forward an action that actually makes it more difficult for these people and these groups of people to be able to come out and access healthcare services, to test, to have access to condoms, to have access to lubricants, to be able to express themselves, all because you want to perpetuate your discrimination. We have seen young people who are unable to access sexual health services because of the actions of healthcare workers in various facilities. So all this is a demonstration as to, yes, stigma may be the root cause, but we have also to deal with the symptoms that show themselves in form of discrimination and eventually manifest in terms of human rights violations. And there are various ways we have been dealing with this that I'll go into later, but definitely without dealing with some of the symptoms that come from the root cause of probably stigma and ignorance, then we cannot win the fight against HIV. And as funders, as people affected by HIV, as civil society groups, as human rights advocates, we must really intensify our efforts to ensure that women can access healthcare services without facing discrimination. Men who have sex with men can easily live their lives without being discriminated. Young people can be able to access sexual reproductive health services whenever they want to, wherever they want to, in a manner that they understand, and that we try to address the problems that arise when people get discriminated. I will then address some of the positive things we have seen around discrimination in my next round of conversation. Over to you, Laurel.
Thanks very much, Alan. So I think we have heard some pretty compelling cases, compelling arguments from Alice on focusing on the language, thoughts, the fears and attitudes that people have that then lead into actions that they may or actions they may perpetuate, injustices they may perpetuate against people they see as different and threatening to them. And Alan speaking really so clearly and compellingly about the what happens to people when their rights are violated, and how much we need to take a stand to fight against the violations of the rights that people face in all of our diversity as people living with HIV and from key population groups. So Alan, you started by saying, I've used this word now a few times, but you started by saying that Alice had made a very compelling case for the importance of focusing on stigma. And then talked about the importance of focusing on discrimination. So what I want to ask you to do now is actually make the other case, take the other side. argue against yourself. Tell us why actually you think we should focus on stigma, and despite being a human rights lawyer with all the experience that you have, what is it about stigma that actually we should be directing our attention there? Make your best case for us that stigma should be our first priority. Back to you, please. Sorry, Ellen, you're on mute, so we're not hearing your best case yet. There you are, perfect.
So I was saying I was going to turn to a slide that will assist me make this compelling case in terms of, as I said earlier, it's almost impossible to separate stigma and discrimination, but you will realize that it is an entire cycle. And I think the first thing that's missing in the cycle is to say that it begins with the ignorance, sometimes lack of information or the knowledge of the information, but you still choose to act in a manner that would prejudice a person who is living with HIV, as is relevant to the conversation today when you're talking about Zero Discrimination Day. We all know that stigma is something that may not be tangible. It may be words, it may be actions, but unfortunately for us from the legal perspective, the fact that it's not something that you can grasp or, for lack of a better word, litigate against, it is something that requires a lot of information, mindset changing, behavioral set changing, and these are things that take a while, things that we have learned in the human rights field don't get funded for a long period of time because people would want to be able to see the results. And so unless we address stigma, we'll not be able to break this what I would say very sad chain that we see here, because it is always a chain reaction, whether it's we are dealing with a nanny who is living with HIV and is taking care of our children, whether we are dealing with a pilot, as we saw in South Africa back in the days, and people do not want to hire a flight attendant because they're living with HIV, whether it's us being discriminative to young people who are living with HIV, the root cause and the beginning is all around stigma. So unless we deal with the root cause and obviously with the symptoms, we will be dealing more with the symptoms and not addressing the root cause, where we would want to see people having a change of mind, where you treat everyone equally, you treat everyone with respect, you have no prejudice, you don't treat people differently because of their race, their health status, their sexual orientation, their physical appearance, and it's extremely important for us to break this cycle. This cycle can only be broken, one, if we put more investment in addressing the root cause, and also where we're not then successful addressing the root cause completely, if there's any spillage that goes to the symptoms, which are reflective of the discrimination and the human rights violations, then we must completely try to see in what long-term projects, what long-term activities are we putting in place that would allow for this change to happen. But most importantly, the obligation falls on the government. The governments who are responsible legally to ensure that we live in environments as human beings that would allow us to be free from stigma, that would allow us to be free from prejudices. Governments must also demonstrate what policies are they putting in place, what programs are they putting into place, what funding are they putting into place, what kind of support are they putting into place to be able to ensure that the root cause of all the problems leading to discrimination, which is ignorance and stigma, is actually then taken into account so that we can see an eradication of discrimination and we can see reduced violations of human rights to ensure people living with and affected by HIV actually live dignified and meaningful life like every other human being. Over.
Thanks very much, Alan. I feel that perhaps you've just conceded the argument to Alice with this focusing on root causes and where we need to build so that people can live without mistreatment based on the attitudes and root causes, the attitudes people hold and the root causes in society. So Alice, let me turn back to you then and say, I would like to hear you now make the case for discrimination. Since Alan may have conceded the point, now we need a defender for discrimination. So could you come back and tell us your best argument for why in this, when there's so much we should be doing and root causes matter so much, why should we actually pay attention to the manifestations that are discrimination? Over to you.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, as well as working on stigma by trying to understand where it comes from better at a developmental level for all of us as we grow from being babies to adults, it's also important, of course, to work at the discrimination end of the spectrum. So here's some positive practical steps to shift stigma and replace discrimination. So in healthcare, the judiciary, the police, among lawmakers, and amongst people living with HIV ourselves, because there's a lot of self-stigma internalized inside us, of course, and then obviously at work, education, environments, etc. There's lots of structural stigma and discrimination at all these levels created by the patriarchal, colonial, racist, sexist, global legacy that shaped all our lives. And I think it really helps us to name those, and by naming them, we can tame them and start to actually set ourselves apart from that and say, we're bigger than this. We can act differently in the world. Just because we have acted in these ways, it doesn't mean we have to continue to, because we weren't born with those isms and those isations and so on, and arches. We can put them aside. So we can change our mindsets and our perceptions, and we can change structures too. So I'm going to just run through some examples. For instance, research. We've done some research over the last few years tracking how very few women living with HIV are included as co-authors and co-researchers in abstracts accepted at IAS conferences. And I have to confess, it's shockingly low. And this reflects structural stigma in the world of researchers who sadly feel that somehow we're incapable of doing research, or that including us would bias their research, despite WHO's guideline on our SRH, which emphasizes the importance of our meaningful involvement in research that affects our lives. And of course, this applies not just to women living with HIV, but the whole community of people living with HIV. So IAS could easily change this and improve the quality of research considerably by ensuring our involvement as co-researchers and co-authors too, of course, so that the right questions are being asked of research from our perspectives, as well as from the outside perspective of researchers, as a criterion for abstract submission. And journals could support this too as a criterion for publication. And that could make a huge difference to the quality of what actually is being researched based on our own lived experiences and perceptions of quality of life issues. Then training, for instance, all educational institutions training healthcare providers or the judiciary or police or whoever could ensure that they include people living with HIV or with other stigmatized experiences in their curriculum development, and to shape their student selection criteria and as lecturers or guest speakers on the courses. In terms of quality of care, I mentioned before, that what is a definition of success of service providers could be our reported experiences of quality of care or not. And all service providers really need trauma-aware care training, because so often post-traumatic stress disorder goes with an HIV diagnosis or with other conditions, and it would just make such a difference if all service providers were already aware of the effects that trauma can have on our health-seeking behaviors. It's widely recognized now in the science, but it's not happening in practice. And similarly, unconscious bias training could make such a huge effect on the way in which we get treated. And then in terms of policy and practice, we can follow the example of the Canadians, where the clinicians there and women living with HIV together have worked really closely together over the last few years to produce two complementary parallel toolkits to advanced woman-centered, rights-based, gender equitable guides to healthcare provision and access across Canada. And you can access those online, and they're fantastic documents. So it really shows that you can really make a change at national level. So those are just some examples that I'd like to share with you as ways in which positive discrimination and action can really make a difference.
Wow, that's tremendous, Alice. Thank you. Thank you. Now I hear that you have both conceded to the other. The case for stigma and discrimination, made incredibly strong presentations for all of us actually on why it matters to address stigma and it matters to address discrimination. In just a few minutes, we're going to go to some questions from the audience, and I see really good questions coming in, and encourage others to please share your questions as well. Before we do that, I want to just go back to each of you one more time. You have some diagrams that we've flashed onto the screen that I think would be really helpful for participants to have those unpacked a little bit in terms of both Alice, the positive language, and what I hear, and you can correct me, as that we can actually act our way into being less stigmatizing, and by doing so, being less discriminatory. And Alan, likewise, that we have to address both the root causes and the manifestations of stigma and discrimination if we are to make more justice. But I think these slides perhaps tell us how you really feel about stigma and discrimination and our approach to that. And so why don't I go, I think first back to Alice, if I could, and if we could see the slide that was just up, Camilla, with the colorful graphic, and ask Alice to speak a little bit about that, and then we'll go back one slide after this and ask Alan the same. So Alice, so some closing thoughts before we go to the Q&A. Tell us how you view what you would make as the case for how we should really be approaching stigma and discrimination related to HIV. Back to you, Alice.
Sure. So this is all really about social norms change, and also about the use of appreciative inquiry, and what we've been learning so much around interpersonal neurobiology and the effects of positive mindsets and positive language, positive perceptions, and solution-focused, forward-thinking planning on the way in which we can really change and shift structures and perceptions. And so it's just trying to map this out a little bit, that of course they're all interconnected. And, you know, we have to take an ecological approach, working at all of these different levels. But there's a lot of science out there that can help us now, and really focusing on positive language, mindsets, actions, laws and policies really can shift the compass, and we all need that.
Super, really, thank you so much, Alice. And now, Alan, to you, tell us now how you really feel. Give us your approach here. Thanks.
I think the approach here is one where we have seen the use of law to challenge stigmatizing and discriminatory practices actually work. We recently saw the courts in Botswana strike down anti-sodomy laws. We recently saw the courts, not the courts, but the parliament in Angola legislating to ensure that there is decriminalization of same-sex consensual relations. We have seen decisions from Namibia that safeguard the rights of women who are living with HIV and subjected to tubal ligation. And also in Kenya, we have seen important decisions that have ensured that people living with HIV have access to generic medicines, and that intellectual property rights do not supersede the right to life for people living with HIV. So they are actually well-designed and thought-out interventions that actually could work and should be funded to work on a larger scale by those who have enough resources to be able to do so. The Global Fund, PEPFAR, Bill and Melinda Gates. There are 7 key programs that the UNAIDS has time and over again promoted that would be helpful in terms of reducing stigma and discrimination. And I think it's important, based on what we've learned from the work that was done by UNDP and UNAIDS on the Global Commission on HIV and the law, to understand the practices, the laws, the policies, the actions by decision makers that actually make people living with HIV live with no respect or dignity. How can they be challenged? And again, how do you fund some of these interventions? Working with the law enforcement, working with the judiciary, working with lawyers, working with the community of people living with HIV, working with women in their different subsets and different expressions, working with young people, working with people in the prisons. How then do you consistently fund that in a way that is based on evidence, that is based on the science, that is based on what is right in terms of the law, and that is based at putting a reality in the life of people. So I think we have the tools, we have the mechanisms, but we need the will and the funding and the support both from donors and from government to be really committed towards ensuring a just life for people living with HIV. And a fight against discrimination, a fight against stigma as it relates to people living with HIV is a fight to put a better environment for all citizens in our country. And so we should look at it that way, that if you win and succeed in a lawsuit that is looking at children who are being discriminated, you're not only accessing the children who are living with HIV, but you're playing to a broader gallery of ensuring the rights of all children are safeguarded. And we need to approach these arguments, these projects, these activities, and these practices in a manner that ensures that we are building up on all the evidence that's available, whether it's from our stigma index, whether it's from our global partnerships that are existing to end stigma and discrimination. How do we use that evidence to be able to make the real change? Because this is the time to actually make the change and reduce the talking and ensure that those who are on the ground are leading the march in terms of making this change.
Thank you so much, Alan. Thank you so much, Alice. What I think is inspiring here is that we do have the tools, we have the science, and we have the practice that tell us that we know what to do to make a difference on both stigma and discrimination. We know it takes the leadership of communities, we know it takes our allies in the human rights field, and we know it takes sustainable funding and political will. What is also interesting to me is that the two graphs to me show, they say that what works at an individual level for us to become less stigmatizing, less discriminatory, also works at a larger structural level. That when we change the laws, the government works in ways that are not discriminatory, and it teaches the people also to behave in ways that are less discriminatory. We know changing the law by itself isn't enough, changing the attitudes by themselves aren't enough, but that there is a synergistic way that these work together. I also really appreciate both of you emphasizing the responsibility of government for the well-being, for the equality of citizens. I think that that's an important key point, as well as the need for leadership by people living with HIV, women living with HIV, and gay men and sex workers, people who use drugs, transgender people, and other really strongly affected populations. So thank you. I think in a moment we'll go to the Q&A. So please keep putting your questions, please put them into the question and answer space so that we don't lose them. If they go into the discussion space, we might not hear them. So we'll go to the questions, but I'd like to hand the floor first back to Dr. Tessa Oraro. I think she'll take us through some quick questions for participants as well. Tessa, back to you.
Thanks, Laurel. Thanks as well to the panel for this really engaging discussion. As we go through and prepare for the Q&A session, some poll questions will come up on the screen just now. Now, we'd really love to know what your opinions are on this. Obviously, it's going to be anonymous, so you can say what you really feel. And if you feel particularly strongly about any of the questions, please do write your comments in the chat box. Thank you. Thank you very much for that. I'll now hand over to Laurel to ask the questions on that have been received.
Sure, thank you. I'm going to try to combine some of these questions in the interest of time. I see a number of questions relating to internalized or self-stigma. Both how does this fit into this framework we're talking about, perhaps where it comes from, what is the relationship perhaps with self-esteem, and what happens in particular when people living with HIV, including women and children living with HIV, are scarred by the stigma they've experienced and internalize that. I think let's start there, and perhaps if I could go back to Alice on that, and then Alan, I may ask if you have more comments on self-stigma, but there's a specific question to you on the law that I'll come back to for you. So Alice, over to you on your thoughts on self-stigma.
Thank you. So I think that I think probably all of us who are living with HIV or have experience of some of the other issues that Alan was describing in terms of stigma and discrimination have experienced self-stigma. I mean, I certainly remember when I was diagnosed, I was literally ready to throw myself under a bus until I was luckily enough and thankfully enough met a woman living with HIV for the first time who very quickly persuaded me that there were better things to do with life. But I think that that is just an example of how, having been brought up in this world where there's so much stigma and discrimination, inevitably so often, sadly, we feel ourselves this stigma and discrimination until we then become a part of it, and that it can take us a long time actually to overcome that self-stigma, which we then turn in on ourselves. And I think that thankfully there are so many different ways of looking at things now. Again, the neuroscience has helped us so much. And for instance, mindfulness has really helped, I think, particularly in recent years, really to understand much more about the importance of self-compassion in so many different contexts, not just about HIV, mental health, issues around drug use, sexual orientation, gender identity, sex work, all kinds of other issues. There's a lot of self-stigma out there. And I think that learning about self-compassion and supporting ourselves to stop being so judgmental about ourselves and to learn to embrace who we are is incredibly important. And I think this applies to all of us, irrespective of whether we're living with any kind of condition or experience or not. And one thing I particularly like to mention, which I find so sad, is that people go on using letters about ourselves. So I can see there's a WL HIV, PL HIV, etc. And I never understand why we have to use letters for people, because it's a way of diminishing us and stigmatizing ourselves as well as others. And it would just be so much better if we just use letters for things or institutions and not for people. If we actually started talking about I am a woman living with HIV, I'm not an HIV infected person, etc., etc. And just changing the language actually starts to reconnect with our own identity.
Thanks so much, Alice. Alan, so I'll see if you want to say anything about self or internalized stigma, but there are a couple of questions about law that I think I'd like to send to you first, and then actually back to Alice as well. Questions about whether it's easier to address discrimination in law compared to how we can address stigma more broadly, and whether so the question from Edwin, do you think that if discrimination in law is created by stigma, is removing that discrimination in law enough to eliminate stigma? And there's a bit more, but I think in the interest of time, let me stop there, go to Alan.
So there are quite a number of questions on the line. I think Alice has covered self-stigma extremely well. I won't go into it, but Let me start with the fact that why discrimination seems to be so easy to deal with. It's because you can actually see its manifestation. You can see children who've been denied access to access school because they're living with HIV. You could see women who've been subjected to tubal ligation merely because of their HIV status. And so those are things that the law actually prohibits in a number of countries, and thus it makes it look easier. Well, not quite easy when you litigate some of these cases, but it looks like things you can actually direct towards various government agencies or various partners who may be involved in it to say, don't do this, don't do that, stop doing this because it's wrong. And then now, beyond just dealing with the law, you then have to deal with the people who apply the law, the people who draft the law, the people who implement the law, the people who interpret the law, because this is a whole cycle and an ecosystem where a person lives. You'll interact with a magistrate or a judge, you'll interact with a police officer, you'll interact with a healthcare worker, you will interact with a prison warden. And so then your programming and your thinking should need to think, if a person living with HIV is likely to interact with these people, what have I done within my funding and my programming to ensure that these people are less, for lack of a better word, are less stigmatizers because they have knowledge around the issue, they have been trained on the issue, they have some level of behavioral change so that you create that enabling environment. So it may be seem easier to deal with discrimination, but actually you have to take a holistic approach to both deal with discrimination, because that could possibly act as a deterrent in many ways when you actually call out the person who is being discriminatory. When action is actually taken against the person who's being discriminatory, that may deter other people from being discriminatory, but that needs to be combined with the behavioral change. I think in terms of Edwin's question, which I've had a chance to look at, yes, it's easy to get zero laws on discrimination. It's easy to try and measure zero discrimination. It may be slightly difficult to measure zero stigmatization because of the fact that I mentioned earlier that in terms of zero discrimination of laws, you'd be looking at a country and saying, do they have laws that criminalize same-sex relationships? Do they have laws that criminalize deliberate infection or intentional exposure for HIV? And if they get those off the book, then they are starting a journey towards ensuring that the legal framework is sound and helpful for people living with HIV. But then to move to the next desired stage of zero stigmatization or zero stigma, then we are then hoping that that removal of the law, that process of removing the policy, has then been supported well with advocacy, education, and information that will get people to have the behavior change. It is true that, especially in many countries where stigma is high, the actual removal of the law may not immediately translate into lives being better for people living with HIV, but it's a very important step not to have the law on the books, because then no one can use the law at that point of time. But whenever the law exists on the book that says it's wrong or it's illegal for a sex worker to be carrying a condom with them or lubricants, or they'll be charged for prostitution or sex work, then the existence of that law makes it even harder to deal with the level of stigma within that country. So again, as many have said in the chat, it's neither this or that, but it's a way of being very strategic on how you combine the interventions to be able to ensure that you're getting the results that are needed in a particular location, in a particular district, in a particular state, in a particular country, or in a particular region. So again, this calls for collective efforts between funders, between communities, between state actors to actually say, we really have to deal with this menace of stigma and discrimination if we want to be able to meet our goals of ensuring more people test for HIV, more people get onto treatment, and less people get infected because they can easily access the prevention measures that are in place without having a threat of being stigmatized or eventually facing discrimination as a result of stigmatization. Over to you, Lauren.
Very clear. Thanks so much, Ellen. I think it's time to, I'll ask you one quick final question in the interest of time. I know there are more questions here. There's a question about the different forms of stigma, and I wonder if something could be posted on the website after that discusses the different forms that stigma take, because there's quite a bit written on that topic. Instead, what I'd like to sum up the intention that I hear in a few of these questions, which is say what works to address, what are some things that work beyond what you've shared already, that work to address stigma, that work to address discrimination, or both, and in particular, what experience do you have working with communities of people living with HIV or of key populations to address the stigma or discrimination? There was one question that was specific about how to do this in countries where these different communities are criminalized, but it could also be in general. What works and how are communities engaged in addressing stigma and discrimination? And Alice, if it's okay, I'll go to you first, and also if you had any thoughts on any of the previous questions, please share whatever you would like us to hear at this point, and then Ellen, I'll go to you next. Alice?
Okay, thank you. Well, first of all, I mean, I think that we're all really agreed that, you know, we need a stick and carrot approach. It's not just a stick, it's not just a carrot. Obviously, you need both, and you need to be working both on stigma and on discrimination, or what I'm trying to suggest, the positive flip side of that. And, you know, of course, I have massive respect for the work that you do, Alan, and all of your colleagues. And absolutely, it's essential to have that, you know, fundamental principles of the rights of law there and upheld. But at the same time, I think that often part of the difficulty is, as you were saying earlier, you know, ignorance is so often part of the root cause of all of this. And that people, because when they're ignorant of something or an issue or different perspectives, then that's where the fear comes in. So often actually what we need is fundamental education. And I think that the difficulty is that law courts are so terrifying and can often create more stigmatizing experiences. For instance, if somebody has to stand up in the public court and explain what happened to her, that can be a terrifying and re-stigmatizing and re-experiencing the trauma of that in itself. And so it would be so great also to be exploring, for instance, different forms of law making, such as restorative justice, which could feel less terrifying to go through and could be more trying to bring different sides together rather than constantly reinforcing that us versus them in the case of the defendant versus the accuser, etc., the prosecutor. Then Edwin mentions about how can you measure for zero stigma? Well, I mean, you can think of the flip side of that. You can certainly measure for positive experiences when it comes to going to a health center or in relation to the police, or for instance, reporting a rape or something that's happened to you. You know, there's so much that you can do around measuring positive experiences rather than, again, trying to focus on the negative all of the time. And if we were actually then having scales for health to measure healthcare providers' success in those terms, I think we could really identify and appreciate when things are working well for us and support others to learn from that and to emulate that. And then in terms of actually, you know, I was mentioning social norms, and we often talk about social norms change in communities, for instance, in relation to intimate partner violence reduction. And there's a huge lot of work that's been done globally about this. And we know that intimate partner violence can stop and can finish. And I would argue strongly that we could actually also do the same in institutions. It's still social norms in institutions. We might not call it that because it's structural rather than informal social. But again, it comes back to the funding. We know how it can happen. I gave you some examples earlier, for instance, from Canada, of how it is happening and how the community of women living with HIV and the clinicians have both learned and grown together in creating this great toolkit. And other examples of where, you know, people from the community have worked closely with healthcare providers. So we know that things can change. But again, it's a question of the funding and the investment and, of course, the political will. So I'll just leave it there.
Alice, thanks very much. It's a really great summary of and response to multiple questions in one. It's really helpful. Alan, over to you. I've put some questions out there, but really respond to whatever in your last few minutes you would like to respond to here.
So I think I'll pick 3 things around working with communities, which I think is extremely important. And I think for those who fund HIV, human rights work, work dealing with stigma, work dealing with behavioral change, starting with the communities and those who actually have the lived experiences is extremely important. And there are very clear ways that you can fund them, including ensuring you support, and we know the role support groups have played during the early years of HIV, and how support for support groups has really dwindled over the years, and how this has also affected adherence to HIV drugs. And so you need to find interventions that support and build the community in terms of taking forward. And in terms of working with the community, it's allowing them to discuss and to agree on what works for them and less for us dictating. So even though I know the law, even though I'm a lawyer, I need to understand what works for them. Do they prefer to go to court? Do they prefer to have alternative dispute resolution? Do they prefer mediation? What actually works with them? And my role then becomes to walk them through that journey of how to get exactly what will make them feel fulfilled and as a respected person within the society. So I think the take-home message is that listen to the communities, work alongside them, work with them, and don't work for them, work alongside them. I think the second issue then, and I saw someone saying that, what do you do in cases where in my country the groups are already criminalized? In many of the countries, groups are criminalized, but you have to start somewhere. Many have found it easier to start from the health angle, saying that if you're really determined towards reducing the number of new infections, increasing the number of people who to take tests, ensuring everyone who tests positive have access to ARVs, then you need to start having a conversation around trans people, sex workers, people who use drugs, men who have sex with men, or young people. And so the conversation has to start somewhere, however hostile and toxic the environment is, because not all countries that have repealed their laws on some of these quite stigmatizing and discriminating practices did it in one day. So we have to do that, but for that to happen, you definitely need funding, and that's important. And I believe there's a lots of funding from the Global Fund. Many countries who are eligible to get funding from the Global Fund are actually encouraged to invest in programs that would reduce stigma, to invest into programs that would reduce discrimination. And I think the third and most important issue I wanted to address was the whole issue of access to justice. And just again, to emphasize what Ali said, yes, legal processes can again be traumatizing, but it also depends on how you structure those legal processes. If you have lawyers who've been trained to be more empathetic and understand how the process goes, if you have judges, and which we do from Global Fund programs that have actually been trained and understand how to deal with HIV cases, how to deal with cases dealing with health discrimination, if you've got media, journalists who've also been trained on how to report so that they don't enhance the stigma but bring out the positive side of the story, then you have the ability to create that environment. And I remain with the conviction that indeed, whether the Global Fund, whether it's PEPFAR, whether it's UNAIDS, whether it's Bill and Melinda Gates, or any other big players that are keen to turning the tide on the HIV response, it would be very critical for us to see how then do we actually address stigma and discrimination, because those are the root cause barriers that make it difficult for people to come out to test, for people to stay and adhere to their medicines, and for people to feel that if I speak out when I face discrimination, I will actually be able to have access to justice that will actually help me to have restorative justice, to be put back in school if it's my child who's been kicked out, if I'm a woman who's been subjected to triple ligation, to get compensation and possibly counseling, if I'm a widow who's been evicted from my land, to get back on my land with my children and to be a productive human being. So I think we need to think from that holistic approach. Indeed, it's important to fund biomedical interventions, but we must also look at the structural interventions and not only fund them, but know exactly who are you funding, do they have the experience, are they working alongside the community, and are they able to measure the results, and the results actually build up over a period of time into an environment that would see us have zero discrimination, so that one day when we come back to celebrate Zero Discrimination Day, we are actually, as Alice would love us to do, just focusing only on the positives of how everything has changed for the better. So that's my hope and dream in terms of this struggle towards ensuring there's no stigma and discrimination going on, not only in the field of HIV, but generally in the world that we live in.
Wonderful. Really, thank you so much, Tessa. I just want to say we need to close. Thank you all. It's been an honor to be here with Alice and Alan in this conversation. Tessa, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Laurel, and thank you so much, Alice, Alan, and Laurel for the role that you've played in this debate. It's really been an engaging conversation, and it's one that has really called us all to account in this movement in the global HIV response. So as we wrap up, I just would like to encourage you to ask any ongoing questions via the email iasedu@iasociety.org. We would like to thank the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation, as well as Merck, Sharp and Dome, our donors, without who this webinar wouldn't be possible. We'll also make sure, given that it was such an interesting conversation, to have a recording available on the Educational Fund website soon. Before the end of this, just as we end this this webinar, there will be an evaluation survey, so you can tell us your feedback on this webinar as we continue to improve our webinars in the future. Finally, I just want to thank you for being here, for engaging and being so engaging in the chat. We would love to do this again, and we wish you a good day, a good evening, and thank you. Goodbye.